Imagine like back in the day when the electric chair was like still a thing. Like that's just crazy. Like people used to get invited to see goddamn executions, bro. That's crazy. America, y'all fucked up, America. Can't believe I live in this. Another reaction for you guys. I don't know why, but I feel like I was just reborn again. So here we go. Let's get to it. Let's do it. Let's feel it.
Was final. The capital punishment reserved for the worst of crimes nearly always ends in the death of the convict, either through lethal injection, hanging, or other forms of execution. However, there have been instances where people have seemingly cheated death and somehow survived execution. So what happens in a situation like this? In this video, we'll be taking you through the incredible stories of people who survived death row and just what happened after. John Babacombe Lee first. Let's talk about perhaps the most well-known survivor of an execution attempt, Englishman John Babacombe Lee. John Lee was born in Abbotsford, Devon in 1864. He was alleged to have murdered his own employer, Emma Keyes, at her home with a knife on the 15th of November, 1884. There wasn't much to prove his involvement in the death of Emma, apart from the fact that he had a suspicious cut on his arm and he had had a pretty extensive rap sheet as a thief. None of this was particularly substantial to the case, but then again, this was the late 19th century, a time when many of the legal principles that we use today were a little less defined. The case against him seemed satisfactory to the court, and even though he pleaded his innocence and the case was mostly circumstantial, John Lee was convicted for Emma Keyes' murder and was sentenced to death. He was set to be executed by hanging on the 23rd of February, 1885. Pending that time, he was to be detained at the infamous Exeter prison. When the time came for him to be executed, though, things took a weird turn. The trapdoor of the scaffold on which John Lee stood failed to open. This was a little odd, as the trapdoor had been previously tested and was fully functional before. After another set of testing, John was placed on the platform again, and again the trapdoor refused to open. A third time they tried to execute him, and they failed. By this time, the medical officer at the execution refused to continue with the proceedings, and the execution attempt ended. The very weird circumstances of John Lee's failed execution attempt raised quite the stir both publicly and at the Home Office. The Home Secretary at the time, Sir William Harcourt, was interested in knowing just what had gone wrong, and so he ordered an immediate investigation into the matter. He then lessened the sentence on John Lee from the death sentence to a life sentence. When the results of the investigation were released, it was discovered that the drawbar on the gallows had been affected when it was moved from the old infirmary into the coach house. This had resulted in the hinges of the trapdoor being bound and unable to drop. It turned out that Lee had escaped death due to a minor alignment issue. However, not even a reduced sentence was enough for John Lee, who continued to petition the Home Office until he was finally released in 1907.
Dang,
after 22
that boy
years in
got
prison.
off.
He not only didn't fully serve his first sentence of the death penalty, he managed to avoid even his commuted sentence. He became a national sensation, earning the nickname the man they couldn't hang. He even got to exploit the fame he got from the incident after his release. He wrote a book and even had a silent movie made about him. He eventually relocated to the USA, where he adopted the name James Lee and lived till 1945. Anne Greenway. Before the events of the failed execution of John Lee over 2 whole centuries before, there was another English person who had survived getting executed. Her name was Anne Green. Anne worked as a scullery maid in the house of Sir Thomas Reed, a justice who lived in Dunsdon, Oxfordshire. She lived the regular life of a 17th century maid until she was approached and seduced by Sir Reed's grandson, Geoffrey Reed. Geoffrey was about 16 or 17 at the time, but that didn't deter him from successfully wooing the 22-year-old Anne. As a result of their activities, she became pregnant. Anne was apparently oblivious to her pregnancy and carried on normally. It wasn't until she miscarried that she realized that she had been pregnant. This was after 17 weeks of pregnancy. Scared of what would happen to her if the entire affair came to light, she decided to hide every evidence of it. That didn't go very well for her, as she was soon discovered. Sir Reed prosecuted Anne for infanticide. He prosecuted in line with the Concealment of Birth of Bastards Act, which gave the presumption of murder on a woman who had concealed the death of her illegitimate child. She pleaded her innocence, but her testimony, along with the testimony of a midwife that the fetus was too young and underdeveloped to be legally considered a living child, was simply not enough, and she was sentenced to death for the crime of infanticide. On the 14th of December, 1650, Anne Green was executed by hanging. In fact, even while she hung, a soldier hit her repeatedly with the butt of his musket. Believing that she was dead, she was eventually lowered and her body was given to the University of Oxford in order to further research. It was when she was brought in by Oxford physicians William Petty and Thomas Willis that they realized that the the supposed cadaver they had been given was still alive. She was extremely weak and her vitals were faint, but she was not dead yet. The doctors moved quickly, treating her with all sorts, determined to save her life. Their efforts seemed to pay off as Anne recovered and was soon back to relatively normal health. News of Anne Green's recovery spread relatively fast, and soon she became the talk of the town. When the authorities heard of what had happened, she was pardoned, as they believed that she must have been innocent, and so God himself had saved her. Anne went on to live for another 9 years before her death in 1659.
Hey.
Kenneth Eugene Smith. We go from 17th century England to 21st century Alabama. Kenneth Smith, a man who in 1988 had been responsible for the murder of a woman, was arrested, tried, and eventually sentenced to death. However, unlike the previously stated cases, Kenneth's execution would take time. Most state-sanctioned executions nowadays aren't carried out right away, and many death row inmates spend quite a bit of time before they are executed. As a matter of fact, according to research done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, as of 2019, death row inmates spend an average of 264 months or 22 years before they are executed, if they are executed at all. And so even though Kenneth Smith was on death row, he would spend the next 33 years of his life incarcerated at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, South Alabama. Eventually, his death warrant was signed, and it was finally time for him to be executed through lethal injection. Throughout his time in prison, Kenneth had come to terms with his death. When he was told about his upcoming execution, he accepted it gracefully. On the 17th of November 2022, the day of his execution, Kenneth went through all the required processes, but when he was finally strapped to the chair was where it all went wrong. At first, at 8:02 p.m., while he was strapped to the gurney but the procedure was yet to start, the 11th Circuit Appeals Court ordered a stay of his execution. However, instead of adhering to it, the prison officials went on with the procedure. Kenneth was supposed to be executed with a combination of drugs: midazolam hydrochloride, rocuronium bromide, and potassium chloride. Normally, these drugs will be delivered through an intravenous injection. Once inside his body, they would shut it down quickly and relatively painlessly. In fact, this swift form of execution is exactly why lethal injection has become more popular across the U.S. as the preferred form of execution. In Kenneth's case, unfortunately, this attempt was anything but swift and painless. The team that was supposed to administer the drugs poked and prodded needles into...
Hey, imagine like back in the day when the electric chair was like still a thing. Like, that's just crazy. Like, people used to get invited to see goddamn executions, bro. That's crazy. America, y'all fucked up, America. Can't believe I live in this
trying
country.
To find a workable vein, but no matter how much they tried, they just couldn't.
The fuck
After
out of
multiple
America.
attempts that
ASAP,
lasted 4 hours,
you.
one of which involved stabbing at his neck, the team finally determined that they could not successfully carry out the procedure, and it was canceled. So what happened to Kenneth afterward? He was hyperventilating, dizzy, and was so weak he could not walk unassisted. He was taken back to his cell, and it was up to the state to determine what to do with him. In a shocking twist, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey decided to temporarily suspend the death penalty in Alabama so as to enable the state to investigate a series of lethal injections. Kenneth was not the only one who had unsuccessfully gone through an attempted execution. He remains alive today, and it is unsure whether his execution will be reattempted or if his sentence will be commuted instead. Joseph Samuel the German.
So what happened?
Joseph Samuel is another well-known person who successfully survived death row. Born in 1780, Joseph was a notorious robber who was apprehended and transported to the British penal settlement at Sydney Cove for incarceration. However, prison just wasn't enough to hold Joseph in, and he succeeded in escaping. After his escape, he joined a gang. One day, his gang, in the process of robbing a house, killed a policeman stationed there named Joseph Luker. Murder of a police officer has always been a serious crime anywhere, and the gang was very quickly hunted down and apprehended. Joseph, who had been identified by a witness, soon confessed to the robbery, but not the murder of Mr. Luker. His argument was not sufficient to the court, and following the principle of vicarious liability, which states that a person is liable for not only the original crime they set out to commit, but any other crime committed in the process, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Ironically, the other members of the gang were acquitted of the charges against them for lack of evidence. On the 26th of September 1803, Joseph was taken to Parramatta to be publicly executed by hanging. He was to be hung by slow strangulation, which was a popular method of execution at the time. A rope made of 5 cords of hemp was tied into a noose at the end, and that noose was strapped over the neck of Joseph Samuel. Normally, within a few minutes into the execution, convicts would be dead. However, when Joseph's execution commenced, the rope snapped and he fell on his knees. It seemed like the only serious injury he sustained was a sprained ankle from this. By this time, the executioner, along with the crowd witnessing the execution, were amazed amazed at what they saw. There had been another convict who had been strangled along with Joseph. He was almost dead while Joseph remained alive. The executioner quickly attached another rope to the gallows, solidly secured the noose around Joseph's neck, and re-attempted the execution. This time, the noose slipped off his neck completely. Frustrated but intent on completing the execution, the executioner again got another rope and fastened the noose around Joseph's neck. Again, the rope snapped. He dropped to the ground and stumbled over. By this time, the crowd was in an uproar, demanding that Joseph be released, as fate clearly wanted him alive. They were so insistent that it soon became apparent that the execution could not go on, and a policeman ordered a temporary delay of the execution till the governor was summoned to determine what would happen to Joseph. When the governor arrived, he ordered an inspection of the ropes to ensure that there was no foul play. The inspection showed that there truly was nothing fishy going on, and so he agreed with the crowd that God willed Joseph Samuel to remain alive, and so he commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. He eventually died in prison in April 1806. Ramel Broom. If we're going to talk about a person on this list who certainly didn't get what he deserved, we'll be talking about Ramel Broom.
Black man.
Ramel was born in Muskegon, Michigan on the 4th of June, 1956, and from a very young age, he was drawn to crime. Even as a teenager, Ramel committed so many crimes that he had to be detained at the Ohio Youth Commission in order to be rehabilitated. All attempts to rehabilitate him failed, and no sooner was he free than he began a streak of crimes. Robbery and rape seemed to be his specialty, especially the rape of little girls. He was arrested, and he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of rape and armed robbery. He was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. On the 11th of May, 1984, after less than 10 years in prison, he was released on parole. That was a mistake. He would go on to add murder to the...
Y'all ever heard of like firing squads? Like, y'all wouldn't have this problem if y'all just line them up. Unless you like survive a gunshot to the face, which is highly unlikely. But is that very inhumane, or I don't know.
List of his crimes when on the 21st of September 1984 he abducted, raped, and murdered 14-year-old Trina Middleton as she was walking home with two of her friends from a football game. 2.5 months later, on the 6th of December 1984, Ramel Broom attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl by the name of Melinda Grissom. Melinda's mother, desperate to save the life of her daughter, held onto the car as she screamed for help. This not only saved the life of her daughter, but it helped lead to the arrest of Broom as two men who observed the whole ordeal noted down the license plate of the vehicle. This helped the police track down and arrest Ramel Broom later that very day. He was charged with murder, rape, kidnapping, and attempted kidnapping. His offer for a plea deal was rejected, and he was convicted on all charges and sentenced to death. On the 15th of September 2009, he was set to be executed. However, things didn't go to plan. The executioners repeatedly tried for over 2 hours to maintain an intravenous line through which they could inject the drugs that would end Ramel's life, but they just couldn't. Eventually, the execution had to be stayed. The incident became quite popular, and Ramel Broom and his lawyers tried to capitalize on this to have his sentence commuted. But in the end, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that the state would go through with his execution. All this did was buy Ramel time. The new date for his execution was set for the 17th of June, 2020. However, this date was pushed back further to the 16th of March, 2022. Broom would not live long enough to be executed, though, as he died from suspected COVID-19 complications at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, on the 28th of December, 2020. Yes.
Yeah, that sucks.
How he managed to avoid death row and managed to live till he was 64 years old.
That
John
sucks.
Smith, born
John Smith. That's the most basic name ever. Whatever, John Smith. But anyway, I'm about to go eat, man. I'm hungry. I can't sit here and just make content all damn night. Like, I have a life, guys. So please support me by watching my other videos. Like, subscribe, do what you need to do to support your boy. Know what I'm saying? All right, peace out.